Hey everybody, this is Kelly from Two Broads Talking Politics. I'm here today with my good friend Jessica Neptune. Jessica's here to talk to us about the Bard Prison Initiative. So, hello Jessica.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Of course, and can you tell us what your title is?
I am the Associate Director of National Programs, and I direct the Bard Prison Initiative Chicago office.
All right, fantastic. So I have wanted Jessica to come on pretty much since we started this podcast, because I think what BPI is doing is really interesting. And so, can you start by telling us just what is Bard Prison Initiative?
Sure. Well, Bard College, which is a small liberal arts college in upstate New York, about 90 miles north of New York City, is one of only a handful of colleges and universities around the country that offers its degrees in prison. There's a growing number of schools doing that, but it's still a relatively small handful. And so there are about 300 students who are full-time Bard students incarcerated in 6 prisons around where Bard is located in upstate New York, going to Bard full-time. So we have satellite campuses in all of those 6 prisons. Those are both medium and maximum security prisons, 5 men's prisons and 1 women's prison. And professors from Bard go into those prisons and teach the same classes that they teach on campus, the same syllabi, the same level of rigor and expectation. Students are admitted first into an associate's degree program, and then if they have the time and the interest, can go on and get a Bard bachelor's degree. And so it's the same Bard curriculum, the same kind of Bard education, everything from first-year seminar and language and thinking that first-year students do on campus, all the way through to senior project, which is at Bard the capstone of a BA. That's been happening now for 15 years. It was something that I helped start when I was an undergraduate at Bard in the late 1990s, and it has grown into this program over the past 15 years, so that now there have been over 800 students enrolled, over 450 students have been released and are out doing all kinds of amazing things. We can talk about that later. And we now have sort of grown from just that core college operation to having an entire apparatus dedicated to reentry and what we think of as alumni. So a whole host of things going on, particularly in New York City, around alumni. And then we have a consortium for the liberal arts in prison, which was started 9 or 10 years ago as Bard grew as big as it was able to, having 300 incarcerated students with a main campus student population of about 2,000 was really as big as the college could get. And so the way to further impact the field and expand was to help other colleges and universities develop their own programs based on their own credits and their own degrees and their own undergraduate curriculums with colleges and universities all over the country. And so we now have 9 or 10 partners, started with Grinnell College in Iowa and Wesleyan University in Connecticut, Goucher in Maryland outside of Baltimore, grew to include Notre Dame and the College of Holy Cross in Indiana, Washington University in St. Louis, FEPS, which is the Freedom Education Project of Puget Sound out in Washington State. Just in the past year, really since I've signed on, come back to the Bard Prison Initiative, we've brought on Bennington College in Vermont, the University of Vermont, Emerson College in Boston, and Yale University through Dwight Hall at Yale.
You said there's a consortium for liberal arts, and so all of these programs are part of the consortium. What does that mean to be part of the consortium? What sorts of things are they working on together? What sorts of things remain separate for the different universities?
All of these programs were started with the assistance of the folks at Bard who launched the Bard Prison Initiative. And so there has been a great deal of really hands-on technical assistance, in-person advising, both on the university end, where you're developing a proposal and going through the often very complicated process of getting that approved all the way up, and really making sure that you're developing a proposal and a pilot project that reflects that university's kind of approach to undergraduate education in the same way that BPI reflects Bard's. So it looks different in each place, but that kind of core principle of bringing to the prison exactly what you do on campus is a shared principle. The protecting and maintaining the integrity and the rigor of that college's degree and credentials, and then working with the Department of Corrections so that you can create the kind of space you need for college to thrive within the prison environment. So there's a lot of hands-on technical assistance. In the early years, BPI had seed money to really help launch these programs financially, and money is always the thing that really, allows a program to happen or not. And then there's just kind of a continued relationship, continued levels of support, and kind of community of practice, as some people say, in terms of providing ongoing logistical or technical assistance kind of support. And so that's on the kind of mechanical side. And then I would say that this is a consortium of educators who are approaching college and prison with a shared set of principles. And so that really has to do with a commitment to the liberal arts. I think all of these programs, as they reflect the curriculum of their home institution, all attempt to bring into the prison the full depth and breadth of the liberal arts in the way that it exists on campus to the prison as much as possible, and those sort of high standards of expectations and rigor. And then the other thing I think that these programs all really have in common is a rejection of some of the things that very typically are assumed, either about college and prison specifically or about expanding access to higher education more broadly, the kind of process of democratizing higher education. And so in particular, I think there's very often an assumption that if you have what I think of as sort of radical inclusiveness at the front end, trying to make sure that as many people as possible can find their way into the classroom, or at least find themselves eligible to apply to attend the college. If you have that kind of openness and inclusiveness at the front end and really are sort of rejecting some of the ways in which typical higher ed application processes really reproduce privilege more than our means to kind of identify potential. So if you're rejecting that, then the assumption often is that the trade-off in doing that is that you have to lower expectations on the back end. So you brought in the kind of front door, but you then must not expect as much of the students who are being brought into your program. And I think across the consortium really reject that assumption and instead have really high expectations and strong ambitions. And those are shared ambitions. Our students have very high ambitions for what's possible. And I think that that's something that's a challenge both to the field of higher ed, as more and more circles are thinking about inclusive excellence and expanding access, but it's also a challenge to the field of criminal justice. So our students are defying expectations in all kinds of ways, and I think very pervasively there are very low expectations for what people coming out of prison are capable of doing, should be doing, the kinds of pipelines that we think of that send people to prison. Too often, reform efforts are kind of creating pipelines for people returning home too, as if there's only a couple things that are expected of people to do, or sort of reasonable, prudent to be imagining as possible. And so we really reject a kind of dampering down on any kind of expectations about what's possible.
And so how do programs join the consortium? Or what is the typical, if there is a typical path to that? Is this something, is the consortium going to schools and asking if they'd be interested? Are schools coming to you? What does that look like?
It's looked different over the years. This is something that's just sort of grown organically. The first couple of schools that joined, there were undergraduates at those schools who knew that BPI started as an undergraduate organization. So they kind of petitioned us to work with them so that they could think about how to push their schools to do the same thing that we did at Bard. There have been other instances where people who, while they were in graduate school, for example, the woman who donated the very first check to BPI was a graduate student at Columbia at the time. As soon as she got tenure at Washington University, she called up BPI and said, I'd like to start teaching inside. And they began to actually think about, well, how about instead of just teaching, how about you start a degree program? Another student who was at Bard when I was at Bard as an undergraduate, when she got tenure at Emerson, wanted to start the Emerson Prison Initiative. So sometimes it's something like that. Indiana was an interesting example where they're one of the few states that had state-level funding for college and prison programs, and with the recession, they were going to lose that funding. And so it began as a partnership between the Department of Corrections and BPI to save college and prison in the face of the loss of public funding. And so that was an instance where BPI sort of sought out an academic partner and went knocking on Notre Dame's door, essentially, and said, we'd like to do this. So it happens differently in different places. As I have started the Bard Prison Initiative Chicago office, the vision there has been partly to serve as a hub of support for all of the programs that are happening in the Midwest already, but also because we have aims to create new programs all over the Midwest, in Illinois, in Wisconsin, in Minnesota, and perhaps new programs in addition to the ones that already exist in Indiana and in Iowa. And so sometimes that does include us, going around and shopping this idea to faculty who very often have never thought about teaching in a prison. It's not their thing at all, but are maybe intrigued by the thought of teaching in a different kind of college environment.
I want to go back to something you said about Bard's program, that it had 5 men's prisons and 1 women's prison currently. And so is that something that you're looking at, that discrepancy in numbers, 5 men's prisons, 1 women's prison? And what does that look like in thinking about that?
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought that up, because my big initiative for 2018 is going to be a focus on women's education, college education for women in prison. And so part of that is actually, I think, building on the strength of what Bard and the consortium has done. So one thing to know about prisons in general and incarceration in America in general is that the vast majority of people in prison are men. So in New York, in fact, only 4% of people in prison are women, and about 10% of BPI students are women. So even though we're in one prison, we have an overrepresentation in terms of the larger prison population. And then the consortium also, I think about 35% of all people enrolled in the various colleges across the consortium are women, and about 18% of people in prison nationally are women. So there's already some strength in what we are currently doing. 2 programs, FEPS in Washington and University of Vermont, are exclusively dedicated to women, and several other programs, including Bard, have college in both men's and women's prisons. And so on the one hand, there's the sort of strength of what we've been doing so far. And on the other hand, there's an incredible need. Women are one of the fastest growing segments of the prison population. Women have been particularly hard hit by the policies of mass incarceration, the most punitive policies, including mandatory minimum sentences. Women's prisons tend to be far more underserved and have far less programs and activities than men's prisons do. The majority of women in prison have experienced abuse, either sexual or violent or otherwise, and have histories of trauma. And so the majority of reform efforts that are going on right now are recognizing that truth and doing a lot of effort to increase what they call trauma-informed care and gender-responsive trauma-informed care. And so while that's addressing a real need, education is almost never a part of those conversations. When we only focus on the needs around trauma, we also run the risk of imagining that women in prison are broken, damaged, and in need of treatment, full stop, period, rather than scholars and leaders, right? Over the last couple of years, there have been a series of these sort of discrepancies that you were sort of gesturing to that have been really alarming to me. Before this job, I had a postdoc with the Obama administration's Federal Interagency Reentry Council, and so that Second Chance Pell was announced during the time that I was working with the Reentry Council. And people who were working in the federal prison system were really struck that no college programs were going into the women's federal system at all. More recently, women in Indiana have lost the only college program that existed in Indiana. In Illinois, there is no college prison to speak of for women prison. And so there is a real need to do more specifically for women. And so this initiative is going to focus on returning college to the Indiana women's prison, where there once was a thriving program and no